A widow was thrown out of her home with 3 children and not a single dollar to her name. But when she found a mysterious house buried in the mountains of North Carolina and a letter nailed to the door written by her dead husband's hand, she discovered that the man she loved had been keeping secrets, secrets hidden beneath the earth, secrets that powerful men would kill to possess. What Nora Calloway found inside that envelope changed everything, and what she found beneath the floorboards, that changed her forever. If you're new here, tap that subscribe button right now because the stories on this channel will stay with you long after you close your eyes tonight. Leave a comment telling us where you're listening from, and let's get into it. The casket lowered slowly into the ground while Nora Calloway held her children's hands so tightly her knuckles turned white. Wren, 8 years old, with her father's dark auburn hair, stood perfectly still, too still for a child. Her eyes were dry and focused on the polished wood disappearing into the earth, as though she were memorizing every detail for a test she hadn't studied for. Beside her, Josiah 5 pressed his face into Nora's hip and sobbed without sound, his small body shaking like a bird caught in wind. And little Laurel, barely 3, sat on Nora's other hip, her thumb in her mouth, her wide hazel eyes watching the grown-ups cry without understanding why. October in Raleigh can fool you. The sky was a perfect indifferent blue. The maples along the cemetery path blazed gold and crimson, and the air smelled like warm earth and dying leaves. It was the kind of autumn day that belongs on a postcard, the kind of day that has no business hosting a funeral. But here they were. Rhodri Pemberton, 37 years old, husband, father of 3, dead in 9 days from a pneumonia that had come on like a freight train and left just as fast, taking everything with it. The minister read from Psalms, but Nora heard none of it. She stared at the dark rectangle of earth and felt the ground tilting beneath her feet as though the hole might widen and swallow her too. 9 days. That was all it had taken. 9 days from the first cough to the last breath. The doctors called it fulminant. They said the word like it explained something. It explained nothing. She could still feel his hand in hers from that final night at the hospital, still warm, still squeezing back faintly like a promise he was trying to keep. And then the monitors flatlined and the nurses came, and someone gently prayed her fingers from his, and just like that, 10 years of marriage became past tense. Across the casket, the Pemberton family stood in a row like figures carved from granite. Harlan Pemberton, Rhodri's father, wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Nora's car. His jaw was set. His eyes moved over the mourners with the calm efficiency of a man scanning a boardroom. Beside him, Constance Pemberton dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, though Nora noticed the dabbing was careful, precise, designed to preserve her make-up rather than dry actual tears. And then there was Genevieve, Rhodri's younger sister, blonde hair pulled back tight, black dress tailored to the millimeter. She didn't bother pretending to cry. She watched Nora with a gaze so steady and cold it could have frosted glass. Nora knew that look. She had known it for 10 years. It was the look that said, "You don't belong here." And maybe she didn't. Nora had grown up in a double-wide outside of Boone, raised by a grandmother who cleaned motel rooms 6 days a week and prayed on the 7th. She met Rhodri at a coffee shop in Asheville where she was waitressing to pay for her teaching certificate. He was an engineer with soft hands and kind eyes who laughed at her jokes and never once looked at her like she was less than. They married within a year. His family never forgave him for it. The reception was held at the Pemberton estate in Hayes Barton, one of those neighborhoods in Raleigh where the houses have names and the lawns have staff. Nora moved through the rooms like a ghost accepting condolences from people she barely knew, holding a plate of food she couldn't eat. The children clung to her legs. Wren hadn't spoken a word since the cemetery. It was Harlan who found her in the hallway near the powder room, standing with Laurel asleep on her shoulder. Nora, tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, my study. We need to discuss arrangements. His voice was the kind of quiet that doesn't need volume. Nora nodded, something cold settling in her stomach. She drove back to the apartment on Glenwood Avenue, the apartment Rhodri had leased 3 years ago, when they moved from their starter home and put the children to bed. Wren lay on her back, staring at the ceiling. Josiah asked if Daddy was cold in the ground, and could they bring him a blanket. Laurel asked for her sippy cup, and then asked for Daddy, and then asked for her sippy cup again. Nora sat on the living room floor after they fell asleep and looked at the photographs on the bookshelf. Rhodri holding newborn Wren, his face lit with a joy so pure it almost hurt to remember. Rhodri teaching Josiah to stack blocks, Rhodri asleep on the couch with Laurel on his chest, both of them open-mouthed, dreaming. She picked up their wedding photo, a courthouse ceremony, Rhodri in a borrowed blazer, Nora in a white sundress she'd bought at a thrift store in Black Mountain. They were laughing, she couldn't remember at what. The apartment felt enormous in the dark. The refrigerator hummed. The hallway clock ticked like a metronome, counting down to something she didn't want to face. She arrived at the Pemberton estate at 10 the next morning, with all 3 children, because she had no one to leave them with. The housekeeper Maria let them in with a look that might have been pity or might have been warning. In Harlan's study, all mahogany paneling and leather-bound books nobody had read. The family was already assembled. Harlan behind his desk, Constance in the wingback chair, Genevieve standing by the window with her arms crossed, and a man Nora didn't recognize. Mid-50s in a navy suit, a leather portfolio open on his knees. "Sit down, Nora." Harlan gestured to a single chair facing the desk. It was positioned lower than his. She noticed that. She sat anyway. Josiah climbed into her lap. Wren stood beside her, one hand on the armrest, her small fingers curling tight. "This is Richard Hale, our family attorney." He'll explain the situation. The attorney opened his portfolio with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Pemberton, Miss Calloway. I'll be direct. The apartment on Glenwood is held under Pemberton Family Holdings, LLC. The vehicle your husband drove is a company asset. The checking account your husband used was funded by a monthly disbursement from the family trust, which terminates upon his death. In short, these assets belong to the Pemberton family, not to you." Nora felt the room tilt. "But we live there. The children's school is 10 minutes away. They're friends there. It isn't your home, Nora." Genevieve's voice cut clean as a scalpel. "It never was. Everything was Rhodri's. And Rhodri is gone." Nora looked at Harlan, searching for something human in his face. He offered nothing. "There's something else." Harlan leaned forward, his fingers steepled. Rhodri was perfectly healthy, a strong, active man in his 30s. And then 9 days of pneumonia, and he's dead. You were the only one with him in that apartment during the worst of it. You understand how that looks. The words landed like a fist. Nora's mouth opened, but nothing came out. "We're not making accusations." Constance touched her pearls. "We're simply saying that if there were to be an investigation, the circumstances might raise questions. Questions that could be very unpleasant for you and for the children." There it was, the threat wrapped in silk. "Sign these." The attorney slid papers across the desk. "Full waiver of any claim to Rhodri Pemberton's estate assets and family trusts. You agree to vacate the apartment within 30 days. Nora's hands trembled in her lap. Josiah whimpered. Wren's grip on the armrest tightened until her knuckles matched the white leather. And if I refused, Genevieve smiled. It was the worst smile Nora had ever seen. Then we make a phone call to the Wake County District Attorney's office. Daddy plays golf with him every other Saturday. Your choice." Nora looked at the papers. The words blurred. She looked at her children, Josiah's tear-streaked face, Wren's rigid jaw, Laurel reaching for the attorney's shiny pen, innocent and oblivious. She signed. The weeks that followed were the longest of Nora's life. She packed their belongings into boxes, while the walls of the apartment seemed to close in tighter each day. She called friends. Most didn't answer. The few who did were apologetic, vague, suddenly busy. Word had gotten out. The Pembertons had made sure of that. Whispers traveled through school pickup lines and neighborhood Facebook groups like Brushfire. "Did you hear? They think she might have done something." Poor Rhodri. That family was always too good for her. Nora's grandmother had died 3 years ago. She had no siblings, no parents she could name. The world, which had once felt manageable, with Rhodri beside her, now stretched out in every direction like an ocean with no shore. She was packing the last of Rhodri's things on a Tuesday night when she found the box. It was old a shoebox, the brand name faded, tucked behind winter coats on the top shelf of the bedroom closet. Inside, beneath a few receipts and a worn copy of a John Muir paperback, her fingers touched something cold and rough. A key, small iron coated in rust, the color of dried blood. It was old-fashioned, the kind that belonged to a door that hadn't been manufactured in 50 years. Tied to it, with a piece of kitchen twine, was a scrap of paper folded once. She recognized the handwriting immediately, the slightly left-leaning letters, the way the R's curled at the bottom. Weaverville, North Carolina. If everything falls apart, go there. It's yours. Oh. Nora sat on the bedroom floor, holding the key and the note, reading the 7 words over and over. Weaverville, a small town north of Asheville in the mountains. Rhodri had never mentioned Weaverville. Not once in 10 years. No trips there. No stories about it. Nothing. She turned the key over in her palm. The rust left orange smudges on her skin. It was impossibly heavy for its size, as though it carried the weight of something she didn't yet understand. Wren appeared in the doorway, pajamas on hair unbrushed. "What's that I don't know yet, sweetheart, but I think your daddy left it for us." 3 days later, Nora and her 3 children boarded a Greyhound bus at the Raleigh station with 2 suitcases, a backpack full of snacks, and $187 in cash. Everything she owned in the world. The bus climbed west through the Piedmont past strip malls and church steeples and fields of late-season tobacco turning brown. Then the land began to rise. The interstate narrowed to 2 lanes. The trees crowded closer, taller oaks and hickories, giving way to hemlocks and white pines. The mountains appeared in the distance like sleeping giants under blue-gray blankets of haze. Josiah pressed his face against the window. "Those are big hills, Mama." "Those are the Blue Ridge Mountains, baby. That's where we're going." Wren sat beside her silent, the rusty key turning slowly between her fingers. She hadn't let go of it since Nora had shown her. Laurel slept in Nora's lap, one fist tangled in her mother's shirt. They arrived in Weaverville at 4:30 in the afternoon. The town was a handful of streets clustered along a 2-lane road surrounded by mountains so green they looked painted. A hardware store, a diner with a hand-lettered sign, a church with a steeple that caught the last of the afternoon sun. Nora stepped off the bus with Laurel on her hip and the other two at her sides. The air hit her first cool, thin, sharp with pine and wood smoke, different from Raleigh's thick suburban exhaust. This air had edges. It woke something in her chest that had been sleeping for weeks. She walked into the diner, a place called Cora's, with checkered curtains and a cowbell on the door, and ordered 3 grilled cheeses and a coffee she could barely afford. The woman behind the counter was mid-60s, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and hands that had clearly done real work. "You look like you've had a day, or maybe a month." "Something like that." Nora managed a half-smile. "I'm looking for a place, a house, out in the woods somewhere around here, built into a hillside maybe. A round door. My husband, I think he built it." The woman studied her for a long moment, then poured Nora's coffee without charging for it. "I've heard talk of a place like that. Folks say there's a strange little house out past Reams Creek, up an old logging road. Nobody lives there. Been empty for years. Ask Emmett Wardlaw at the hardware store. He knows every back road in this county." Emmett Wardlaw was a thin man with a white mustache and overalls who listened to Nora's description, scratched his jaw, and drew her a map on the back of a receipt. "Old fire road off Ox Creek," he said. "Take it about 4 miles up. Past the second creek crossing, there's a footpath on your left, marked with a cairn. Follow it maybe a half-mile into the woods. Can't miss it." "Well, you can, actually, but you'll find it if you're meant to." Emmett offered to drive them part way in his truck. The road turned from asphalt to gravel to dirt climbing through forests so dense the canopy formed a tunnel of green and gold. When the truck couldn't go any farther, they got out. Nora thanked him and watched his taillights disappear back down the mountain. Then she turned to face the woods. The path was narrow, overgrown, barely visible beneath fallen leaves. She carried Laurel. Wren walked ahead with the focus of a scout. Josiah held Nora's free hand and didn't complain, though his legs were short and the climb was steep. They walked for 40 minutes. The forest thickened. The light softened to a green-gold haze. The air smelled of wet earth and moss and something sweet, wild azaleas maybe, or rhododendron blooming late. A creek ran somewhere nearby, its voice a steady murmur over stones, and then the path opened into a clearing, and there it was. The house was half buried in the hillside, as though the mountain had grown around it, or as though someone had tucked it into the earth like a secret. The roof was covered in thick grass and wildflowers, a living carpet of green dotted with purple asters and goldenrod. The front wall was stone and timber, aged to silver gray, and the door was round, made of thick oak planks, held together with iron bands set into the hillside like the entrance to another world. Around it, ferns grew waist-high. A dogwood tree leaned over the doorway, its branches still holding a few late-season leaves the color of wine. The clearing was quiet except for the creek and the wind and the Carolina wren singing from somewhere in the canopy a bright rolling song that seemed to welcome them. Mama Wren breathed, "Is that a hobbit house?" Nora couldn't speak. She walked to the round door, pulled the rusty key from her pocket, and fitted it into the lock. It resisted for a moment, rust against rust metal, remembering metal, and then turned with a click that echoed in the clearing like a heartbeat. The door swung inward. Inside was dark, cool, and smelled of cedar and thyme. Nora's eyes adjusted slowly. The ceiling was vaulted, supported by hand-hewn beams. The walls were thick stone plastered smooth. A fireplace built from river rock dominated one wall. There was a kitchen simple, with a cast-iron wood stove and open shelving. A table made from a single slab of walnut, sanded smooth, the grain rippling like water. 2 chairs, a bed frame in the back, bare but solid. Everything was coated in dust and silence. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like lace curtains. But beneath the neglect, the craftsmanship was unmistakable. Every joint was tight. Every beam was true. Whoever had built this house had done it with patience, with skill, and with love. Wren found a kerosene lamp on the mantel. Nora lit it with matches from her backpack, and warm light filled the room, revealing details: a row of hooks by the door carved to look like acorns, a window seat built into the stone wall with a view of the forest, a child-sized stool tucked under the table, as though the builder had already imagined small legs swinging from it. Rhodri had built this with his own hands, for them. Nora set Laurel down on the window seat. Josiah climbed onto the bed frame and bounced experimentally. Wren stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it all in. They slept that night piled together on the bare mattress Nora found in a cedar chest covered with jackets and the one thin blanket from the bus. The fire crackled in the stone hearth. The children fell asleep quickly, exhausted, their breathing soft and even. Nora lay awake, listening to the forest, the creek, the wind, an owl calling from the ridge above. She was 35 years old. She had $112 left. She was alone in a house she hadn't known existed 12 hours ago, in the middle of a forest on a mountain, with 3 children and no plan. But the roof didn't leak. The fire was warm, and for the first time in weeks, the tightness in her chest loosened just enough to let her breathe. She woke before dawn. The children were still sleeping. She stepped outside barefoot onto the cold ground and watched the sky lighten above the mountains. Mist rose from the valley below like smoke, and the first birds began to sing tentatively at first, then building voice upon voice until the whole forest hummed with morning. She walked around the house, discovering a spring that bubbled from a rock face 20 yards away, clear and cold. An overgrown garden where herbs had gone wild, rosemary, lavender, mint pushing through the weeds, apple trees gnarled and unpruned but heavy with small, hard fruit. And then she came back to the front door and stopped. There, nailed to the oak with a single rusted nail, was an envelope. Thick manila, slightly weathered. Her name was written across the front in handwriting she would have known anywhere in the world. Nora. Just her name, nothing else. It had not been there last night. She was certain of it. She had stood at this door, had fit the key into the lock, had pushed it open. There was no envelope. She would have seen it. She would have felt it under her hand, but here it was. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it free from the nail. The envelope was sealed. She tore it open and found several documents, folded, official-looking bearing stamps and signatures, and beneath them a letter, pages of it, handwritten on lined paper in Rhodri's careful left-leaning script. She unfolded the first page and began to read, standing in the doorway of a house she was only beginning to understand, while the sun rose over the Blue Ridge Mountains and the mist burned away, and her children slept inside, dreaming of a father who had loved them enough to build a world they could hide in. "My dearest Nora," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then the worst has happened, and I'm no longer with you. Forgive me for not telling you sooner, but I needed to protect you from my family, from their greed, from everything they would try to take." The pages trembled in her hands. The morning light caught the edge of the rusty key still hanging from the lock where she'd left it, turning it to copper, to gold, to something almost precious. She kept reading. "This house was built with bare hands and a full heart. It is yours, Nora, yours and the children's. They can never take it from you. The deed is in your name. Every nail, every beam, every stone, I put them there thinking of you. But there is more. Beneath the floorboard by the fireplace you'll find what you need to begin again. Trust me one last time." Nora lowered the letter. Her vision blurred. She looked at the house, this impossible, hidden, half-buried house that her husband had built in secret over years of weekends she thought he'd spent on business trips. She looked at the deed among the documents stamped and notarized 12 acres in Buncombe County, North Carolina, in the name of Eleanora Rose Calloway. She looked at the forest, vast and green and indifferent to human grief. She looked at the mountains, ancient and patient. And then she heard it, a small voice from inside the house. Mama Wren stood in the round doorway, the morning light catching her auburn hair. "Are you crying?" Nora knelt and pulled her daughter close, pressing her face against Wren's hair, breathing in the smell of wood smoke and sleep and childhood. "Your daddy loved us so much, baby. More than I ever knew." Wren looked at the letter in her mother's hand, then at the key hanging from the lock. She reached out and touched it, the rust, the weight, the cold iron warming slowly under her small fingers. "Is this our house now, Mama?" Nora wiped her eyes and looked at the round door, the stone walls, the living roof, where wildflowers swayed in the morning breeze. She thought of Rhodri somewhere in the ground back in Raleigh, far from this place he had built with his own 2 hands. She thought of the Pembertons in their mansion with their lawyers and their threats and their cold, calculated cruelty. She thought of the documents in the envelope, the deed, the letter, whatever waited beneath the floorboards. And she thought of the key, rusty, ancient, too heavy for its size, the key that had opened this door, the key that was beginning to open something else, something inside her that had been locked shut for a very long time. "Yes, sweetheart, this is our house now." But what Nora didn't know yet, what she wouldn't discover until she pried up that loose floorboard beside the fireplace, was that Rhodri Pemberton's secrets went far deeper than a hidden house in the woods. They went deep into the earth itself. And there were men in these mountains who already knew what lay beneath her feet. Men who had been waiting for someone to come and claim this land. Men who would do anything, absolutely anything, to take it from her. The morning light shifted. A cloud crossed the sun, and somewhere deep in the mountain, in tunnels that hadn't seen light in 1,000 years, something waited in the dark. The floorboard beside the fireplace was darker than the others, shorter by half an inch. Nora knelt on the cold stone hearth and pressed her fingertips along its edge until she felt it a slight give a breath of air rising from below. She worked her nails into the gap and pulled. The board resisted, then came free with a groan that sounded almost human. Beneath it was a hollow in the packed earth lined with cedar planks to keep out moisture. Inside sat a metal lockbox, dull green, the kind sold at army surplus stores, heavy when she lifted it. The small keyhole on the front matched nothing she had but tucked inside the envelope with Rhodri's letter. Was a key she hadn't noticed before. Tiny brass, newer than the iron one that had opened the front door. It fit. The lid swung up. Inside, wrapped in a plastic freezer bag, were bundles of cash, 20s and 50s, rubber-banded tight. Nora counted them on the walnut table while the children ate the last of the granola bars from her backpack. $14,600. Beneath the money, a prepaid debit card in her name and a folded note in Rhodri's hand. This is what I could save without them noticing. Use it wisely. It has to last. I love you. I love them. Ah. Nora pressed the note to her lips and closed her eyes. Then she put the money back in the box, slid the box under the bed, and made a list on the back of the bus receipt. Firewood, water jugs, canned food, blankets, candles, batteries, first aid kit. She had a roof. She had money. She had a list. For the first time in weeks, she had a direction to walk in. Getting to town was the first problem. The logging road was 4 miles of broken gravel and mud, impossible without a vehicle. With 3 children and no car, the walk took nearly 2 hours each way. Laurel rode on Nora's back in a makeshift sling made from a bedsheet. Josiah lasted about a mile before his legs gave out and Nora carried him on her hip until her arms burned. Only Wren kept pace, without complaint, her jaw set in that way that reminded Nora so much of Rhodri it made her chest ache. They made the trip 3 times that first week. Each time Nora bought what she could carry and nothing more. Rice, beans, canned vegetables, powdered milk. Matches a second-hand pot from the thrift store on Main Street. She rationed the money with the precision of someone who understood in her bones what it meant to have none. The house fought her at every turn. The wood stove smoked until she cleared a bird's nest from the chimney pipe, standing on the roof in the rain, coughing, her eyes streaming. The spring water was clean, but the pipe Rhodri had rigged to carry it to the kitchen had cracked over the winter. She spent an entire afternoon wrapping it with electrical tape and duct tape and prayer, and still it leaked at the joint, dripping a steady rhythm onto the stone floor that kept her awake at night. The children adapted faster than she did. Wren appointed herself keeper of the fire, feeding it with the seriousness of a surgeon. Josiah discovered the creek and spent hours building dams out of sticks and mud, coming home soaked and grinning for the first time since the funeral. Laurel followed a box turtle around the clearing for an entire morning, narrating its journey in a language only she understood. But the nights were hard. Without electricity, darkness came absolute. The kerosene lamp threw a circle of amber light that reached the walls and stopped, leaving corners full of shadow. The forest sounds that seemed charming by day, birdsong when the creek's murmur transformed after dark into something larger, branches cracking under unknown weight, a scream that might have been a fox or might have been something else entirely. Once, the heavy, rhythmic breathing of an animal just outside the window that Nora lay listening to for an hour, the kitchen knife on the pillow beside her, until it moved on. Josiah had nightmares. He woke screaming for his father at 2 in the morning, and Nora held him against her chest, rocking, singing the lullaby her grandmother used to sing, "Hush, little baby, don't say a word," until his breathing slowed and his fists unclenched, and he slept again. Then she sat in the dark, exhausted beyond tears, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake bringing them here. It was Cora Suttles who saved them from isolation. Nora had gone back to the diner for coffee and supplies. Cora watched her count coins on the counter, watched the children share a single grilled cheese cut into 3 uneven pieces, and said nothing. But when Nora got up to leave, there was a paper bag on the counter that hadn't been there before. "I didn't order this." Cora was already wiping down the far end of the counter. "Leftovers. They'll just go to waste. Take them, or I'm feeding them to the dog, and my dog's already fat." Inside the bag were 2 roast chicken legs, a container of mashed potatoes, a bag of apples, and a jar of homemade applesauce with a handwritten label. The next time Nora came, there was another bag, and the time after that. Cora never acknowledged it, never made Nora feel small for accepting. It was done quietly, like passing a note under a desk. This was the mountain way Nora would learn help offered sideways without eye contact, so that the person receiving it could pretend it was their own idea to accept. 2 weeks after their arrival, a man appeared at the edge of the clearing. Nora saw him from the window and reached for the knife before she even thought about it. He was old 70 at least, with deep brown skin, weathered to leather white hair, pulled back in a loose tail, and a frame that had once been powerful, but had settled into the angular thinness of age. He leaned on a walking stick carved from a single branch of sourwood. Behind him a mule stood, tied to a hemlock, loaded with lumber. He didn't approach the house. He stood at the tree line and waited. Nora went outside the knife behind her back. "Can I help you?" The old man studied her with dark eyes that missed nothing. "You're Rhodri's wife." It wasn't a question. Nora tightened her grip on the knife. "Who are you, Ephraim Redthorn? I taught your husband how to hold a chisel without cutting his own thumb off. He was terrible at first. Got better." He tilted his head toward the house. "Helped him lay the stones, too. Took us 3 weekends just to get the arch over the door right." Nora felt something loosen in her chest. She lowered the knife. "You knew Rhodri?" Ephraim nodded slowly. "He came to my place about 6 years ago, lost in the woods looking for land he'd just bought. Didn't know a mortise from a mitre, but he wanted to learn. Said he was building something for his family, a place that couldn't be taken away." He looked at the house with an expression Nora couldn't quite read, pride maybe, or grief, or both, woven together so tightly they'd become the same thing. "I heard he passed." "I'm sorry. He was a good one. Rare kind." Nora's eyes burned. She blinked hard. "Thank you." Ephraim gestured to the mule. "Brought some timber. Your porch railings rotted through, and those window frames need replacing before the first frost, or you'll freeze." "I don't need paying. Rhodri already paid in years of company and more bad jokes than any man should have to endure." He worked for 3 days, quietly, steadily, with the economy of motion that comes from decades of practice. He replaced the window frames with white oak he'd milled himself. He rebuilt the porch railing. He fixed the water pipe properly, a coupling joint, and a length of copper tubing, and the dripping stopped. The children orbited him with cautious fascination. Wren watched him work with intense focus. Asking questions, he answered patiently. "What kind of wood is that white oak? Why not pine soft? Rots in 10 years. Oak lasts 100 if you treat it right. Can I try? Hold it like this. Both hands. Respect the grain." Josiah brought him cups of water from the spring, carried carefully in both hands, spilling half on the way. Ephraim accepted each cup gravely, as though it were fine wine. Laurel simply sat near him, arranging wood shavings into patterns on the ground, and he led her. On the third evening after the children were asleep, Ephraim sat with Nora by the fire outside. The sky was enormous above the clearing, more stars than Nora had ever seen the Milky Way, a smear of light across the darkness. "He came here broken," Ephraim said, staring into the flames. "Not broken like damaged, broken like a man carrying something too heavy. His family, he talked about them sometimes. Said they'd never see you the way he did. Said they'd try to take everything if he wasn't there to stop them. That's why he built this place in secret. Every beam, every stone. His insurance policy." He paused and poked the fire with his stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "He was happy here, Nora. Happiest I ever saw him, covered in sawdust, hands full of splinters, laughing at nothing. He said once, I remember it clear, he said, this house was built with bare hands and a full heart, Ephraim. That's all that matters." Nora stared into the fire and let the tears come without wiping them away. Before Ephraim left the next morning, he told her about the back of the house. "There's a door in the hillside around back, buried under a honeysuckle, Rhodri's workshop. He spent more time there than anywhere. You should see it." Nora found the door that afternoon. It took 20 minutes of pulling away vines and dead growth to reach it, a low wooden door set into the hillside, secured with a padlock that yielded to a key she found hanging on a nail inside the kitchen cabinet. The space beyond was larger than she expected. A room carved into the earth itself, braced with timber, framing the ceiling low but solid. Rhodri's workshop. Nora stepped inside and felt the air change, cooler, drier, smelling of sawdust and linseed oil, and something that was simply unmistakably him. Tools lined the walls on hand-built racks, chisels, planes, saws, clamps, dozens of them, each in its place, well-oiled and sharp. A workbench dominated the center, scarred with used surface, still dusted with shavings, as though he'd walked away mid-project. On the bench sat an unfinished rocking chair, its spindles half-turned, the seat planed smooth but not yet sanded. A child-sized rocking chair. Nora touched it and felt the wood warm under her fingers. He had been making this for one of the children. She didn't know which one. She would never know which one. On a shelf above the bench, she found photographs. Rhodri grinning, covered in sawdust, holding up a finished stool like a trophy. Rhodri and Ephraim standing beside the completed door frame, both of them laughing. Rhodri alone, sitting on the porch he'd built, looking out at the mountains with an expression of such peace that Nora had to set the photo down and press her hands against her eyes. There were more rooms. The workshop opened into a natural passage, not a doorway, but a crack in the rock that widened into a corridor of rough stone. Nora followed it with the kerosene lamp held high, her free hand trailing along the damp wall. The passage descended gently, turning once, twice. The air grew cooler. The sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere ahead. And then she heard breathing. Not hers, not wind. Breathing ragged, wet, unmistakably human, coming from the darkness beyond the reach of her lamp. Nora froze, every muscle locked. The flame shivered in her grip. "Hello!" Her voice cracked against the stone. Silence, then a cough, deep rattling, the cough of lungs that hadn't had clean air in too long. "Please." A man's voice thin as paper. "Please, I can hear you. I know someone's there. I've been down here so long, please." Nora took a step backward. "Who are you? How did you get here?" A long pause. The breathing again, labored, desperate. "My name is Silas Tate. Rhodri Pemberton hired me to survey these caves. 2 years ago, there was a collapse. I couldn't get out. He said he'd bring help. He never came back. 2 years." Nora's stomach turned. She thought of Rhodri's sudden illness, the 9 days the way the Pemberton had closed ranks. If he'd been planning to come back for Silas, and something had stopped him. "I'm coming closer," she said, and hated that her voice shook. "Don't move." She found him 30 feet farther, sitting against the cave wall in a widened chamber, where a thin stream of water ran across the floor. The lamplight fell on him, and she saw a man who had once been sturdy, broad shoulders, thick forearms, reduced to bone and tendon. His skin was the grey-white of something kept from sunlight. His beard hung to his chest in matted tangles. His clothes were rags. But his eyes, when they found the light, were clear and sane, and full of a gratitude so overwhelming it looked like grief. "You're real," he whispered. "You're actually real." She gave him water from the canteen she'd brought into the workshop. He drank slowly, his hands shaking so badly she had to steady the bottle. She gave him a granola bar, and he ate it in small bites, tears running silently down his hollow cheeks. The story came out in fragments over the next hour, as Nora helped him crawl back through the passage toward the workshop. Rhodri had heard rumors about mineral deposits in these mountains. He'd hired Silas, a retired mining surveyor from Spruce Pine, to map the cave system beneath the property. They'd worked together for months, weekends, only always in secret. Then the collapse. A section of tunnel had given way, trapping Silas in the lower chambers. Rhodri had dug for hours, but couldn't break through alone. He'd promised to come back with equipment, with help. He never did. Silas had survived on cave water, on blind crayfish he caught in the underground stream, on mushrooms and lichens that grew in the dark. He'd found a narrow crevice that opened onto a cliff face, barely passable, dangerous, that gave him occasional access to the outside. But he was too weak to climb, far too disoriented from months in darkness to navigate the forest. So he'd stayed waiting for a help that never came. "There's something else you need to know," Silas said as Nora settled him onto the workshop floor and covered him with a drop cloth. The reason Rhodri was so secretive, the reason he bought this land. He was trembling from cold, from exhaustion, from something else. "There's a vein in the lower chamber. I found it after the collapse when I was exploring, trying to find a way out. A vein of corundum. Sapphire specifically. Star sapphire. The kind with the asterism, the 6-pointed star that forms inside the stone." He looked at her with those 2 bright eyes. "It's enormous, Nora. The largest deposit I've ever seen in 40 years of survey work. We're talking tens of millions of dollars, maybe more." And Rhodri knew it was there. That's why he bought the land. That's why he kept it secret. And that's why Boone Aldridge has been trying to get his hands on this property for years. Nora felt the ground shift beneath her. Boone Aldridge. She'd seen the name on signs driving into town: Aldridge Mining, Aldridge Realty, Aldridge Community Fund. The name was everywhere, stamped on Weaverville like a brand on cattle. Who is he? Silas closed his eyes. He owns every operating mine in this county. Mika Feldspar Quartz has political connections all the way to Raleigh, and he knew about the sapphire before Rhodri did. Tried to buy this land first, but the previous owner sold to Rhodri instead. Boone doesn't forgive things like that. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, barely above a whisper, "The last time Rhodri was here, I saw trucks on the logging road. 2 men watching from the tree line. I told Rhodri. He said he'd handle it. 3 weeks later, he was dead." Nora sat on the workshop floor in the half-dark, surrounded by her dead husband's tools and his unfinished rocking chair, and the knowledge that the ground beneath her children's sleeping bodies held a fortune that men had possibly killed for. She wanted to run. The old reflex, the one the Pembertons had trained into her, said, "Pack the bags, take the children, disappear. Start over somewhere else. Somewhere without caves and secrets and powerful men who wanted what was hers." But she looked at the rusty key still hanging from the cord around Wren's neck. Her daughter had taken to wearing it like a talisman, and she thought of Rhodri's letter. "They can never take it from you. No more running." She spent the next 2 days caring for Silas in the workshop, bringing food and water, keeping his presence hidden from the children. He grew stronger slowly. She learned he was 55, a widower, no children, a man who had simply vanished from the world, and the world hadn't noticed. On the 3rd night, Nora sat by the hearth after the children fell asleep, going through Rhodri's documents one more time. The deed, the survey maps, and something she'd overlooked, a USB drive in a small plastic bag taped to the inside of the metal lockbox lid. She hadn't noticed it before. It was tiny black, almost invisible against the dark metal. She had no computer, no electricity to run one, but she pocketed it, knowing it mattered, without yet knowing why. It was past midnight when she heard the engines. Not one vehicle, several, climbing the logging road with the grinding persistence of machines that don't care what's in their way. Headlights swept through the trees, visible through the kitchen window in slashes of white. Nora moved before she thought. She shook Wren awake. "Get your brother and sister now. Don't talk, don't turn on the lamp. Follow me." Wren obeyed without a word. 8 years old and already fluent in emergency. She pulled Josiah from his bunk with one hand and scooped Laurel with the other. Nora grabbed the lockbox, the documents, the USB drive. They went out the back door into the cold mountain air and down to the workshop. Silas was already awake, standing in the dark, listening. "Aldridge," he said. "Has to be. Can you walk? I can do what I have to do." Above them, through the hillside, they heard the front door splinter, boots on the stone floor, furniture overturned, a man's voice, deep and unhurried, giving orders. "Check every room, find the survey maps, and find whatever entrance leads to the lower caves. Pemberton was digging here, and I want to know exactly where." Another voice, younger, rougher. "What about the woman and the kids?" The first voice, again cold, measured the voice of a man accustomed to owning everything within earshot. She'll cooperate. They always do." Nora's hands were shaking. Silas touched her arm in the dark. "The caves. There's a way through to the other side of the ridge. It's tight and it's rough, but it comes out above Reams Creek. I've done it before. Can the children handle it? They'll handle it." Nora's voice was steady now. Fear had burned through her and come out the other side as something harder, something with edges. They entered the cave passage. Silas went first with the kerosene lamp turned low, barely aglow. Nora carried Laurel. Wren held Josiah's hand. The tunnel narrowed, the ceiling dropped. They walked bent at the waist, then crouching, then nearly crawling. Josiah whimpered, "Mama, I can't see. I know, baby. Hold Wren's hand. Don't let go. We're almost through." They weren't almost through. The passage wound deeper into the mountain, descending through chambers where water dripped from formations that had been growing for millennia. The air was cold and clean and tasted of minerals. Their footsteps echoed and multiplied until it sounded like a dozen people walking. Behind them, far behind, but audible through the stone, a shout. Then another. They'd found the workshop. They'd found the passage entrance. Faster, Silas urged. They moved through a narrow squeeze where the walls pressed against Nora's shoulders on both sides, and Laurel screamed against her chest. Through a chamber where the ceiling opened high enough that the lamplight couldn't reach it, and their breath echoed like whispers in a cathedral. Past the sapphire vein, Nora caught a glimpse of it as they passed a wall of blue-gray stone shot through with flashes of deep cornflower blue that caught the lamplight and threw it back in points of cold fire. Then Silas stopped, here. The crevice. It was barely a gap in the rock face, shoulder width at best, angling upward at 45 degrees. Cold air poured through it from above, carrying the smell of pine and open sky. Wren goes first. She's smallest. Then the boy. Then you hand me the baby and climb up yourself. I'll come last. Wren looked at the dark slash in the rock. She reached up and touched the rusty key around her neck, closed her fingers around it, and nodded. She climbed. Her small body disappeared into the gap. Nora heard her sneakers scraping against stone, heard her breathing fast but controlled, and then after an eternity, Wren's voice drifted down from above. "I'm through, Mama. I can see stars." Josiah went next, crying silently, his hands trembling on the rock. Nora boosted him up and listened to him climb, listened to Wren coaching him from above. "Come on, Joe, just a little more. I've got you." Nora passed Laurel up to Silas, who lifted the toddler into the crevice where Josiah's hands reached down to take her. Then Nora climbed the rock, tearing at her jacket, her elbows, her knees. The gap was tighter than she'd expected. For one terrible moment, she stuck her hips wedged between two immovable walls of stone, and the panic hit her like a wave, black and total. Then she thought of 3 children above her, alone on a mountain in the dark, and she exhaled every molecule of air in her lungs, and twisted and pulled and scraped through with skin left behind on the limestone. She emerged onto a narrow ledge above a forested valley. The sky was moonless, but thick with stars. The air was sharp and sweet. Below, a creek glinted silver in the starlight. Silas came through last, gasping, gray-faced with effort. They sat on the ledge, 5 people breathing hard in the dark, and listened. From deep inside the mountain, muffled by 100 feet of rock, they heard voices. Boone's men searching, following, but they wouldn't fit through the crevice. not grown men with wide shoulders and equipment belts. The gap was barely passable for a woman and 3 children. For the first time that night, Nora felt something other than terror. The climb down took an hour. Silas guided them along a goat path that switched back down the ridge through rhododendron thickets, so dense they moved in complete darkness, guided only by touch and the sound of the creek growing louder below. Laurel slept against Nora's chest, oblivious. Josiah held the back of Nora's jacket and walked with his eyes closed, trusting. Wren brought up the rear, steady as a metronome. They reached the creek. They followed it north, stumbling over roots and river rocks in the dark, and just before dawn they saw it alight. A porch light, yellow and warm, burning outside a cabin set back in the hemlocks. Ephraim's place. The old man opened his door before they knocked. He looked at Nora, torn clothes, bleeding hands, 3 children clinging to her legs, a stranger behind her who looked like he'd crawled out of a grave, and said nothing. He held the door wide and stepped aside. Nora carried her children across that threshold and set them down on the warm pine floor and wrapped them in quilts that smelled of cedar and wood shavings. She accepted the mug of coffee Ephraim pressed into her shaking hands, and then she walked back to the door and looked out at the mountain, her land, the place her husband had built for them with bare hands and a full heart, and saw in the first grey light of dawn a column of dust rising from the logging road. More trucks. Coming up. Boone Aldridge wasn't finished. Ephraim made a phone call before the sun cleared the ridge. Nora didn't hear what he said. She was in the back room, kneeling on the floor beside 3 sleeping children, watching their faces in the amber glow of a kerosene lamp. Wren's hand still held the rusty key at her throat, her fingers curled around it, even in sleep. 20 minutes later, the first truck arrived, not Boone's, an old Ford with a cracked windshield and a bed full of tools. A man named Luther Gaines stepped out, mid-60s, former bricklayer, arms like fence posts. He nodded at Ephraim, leaned his shotgun against the porch railing and poured himself coffee without being asked. Then another truck, then 2 more. By the time the sun was fully up, 8 men and 3 women stood in Ephraim's yard, breath steaming in the mountain air. Nora recognized none of them. They knew her anyway. They were the people Rhodri had helped during his secret years in these mountains. The widow whose porch he'd rebuilt after a storm, the veteran whose cabin he'd insulated for free, the family whose well he'd dug when theirs ran dry. They had never met Nora, but they had loved Rhodri, and in these hills that was the same thing. Nobody made speeches. Luther and 2 others drove to Nora's property and stood at the tree line with their arms crossed when Boone's men returned at mid-morning. There was a conversation Nora wasn't part of, short 10s, conducted in the flat voices of men who understood violence without needing to use it. Boone's crew left within the hour. Over the following days, the community repaired what Boone's people had broken. The splintered front door was replaced with one even heavier, thick, chestnut iron-banded fitted by Luther himself. The overturned furniture was righted. The ransacked rooms were cleaned. Someone left a crate of canned goods on the porch with no note. Someone else left a cord of split firewood stacked neatly beside the house. Nora tried to thank them. Most wouldn't let her. Rhodri never asked for thanks either, said a woman named Mavis, who'd brought 3 jars of blackberry preserves and a quilt for the children. Don't insult his memory by starting now. Cora drove up from town with a box of groceries and something else, the name and number of a lawyer. Her nephew, she said, works for a non-profit down in Asheville, Appalachian Land Defense. They handle property disputes, mineral rights, eminent domain, the kinds of fights regular people can't afford to win on their own. His name is Dale Fry. He's not fancy, but he's honest, and he doesn't lose often. Nora called from Cora's phone the next morning. Dale Fry answered on the second ring. He listened without interrupting for 12 minutes while Nora told him everything: the land, the deed, the cave system, the sapphire deposit, Boone Aldridge, the break-in, Silas. When she finished, the line was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'll be there Thursday. Don't talk to anyone else before then. And don't let Aldridge or his people onto that property again. You have every legal right to refuse entry. Use it." Thursday came. Dale Fry was a slight man in his 40s with wire-rimmed glasses and a suit that had seen better decades. He sat at Nora's walnut table, examined every document, took photographs of the deed and the survey maps, and asked questions in a voice so calm it made Nora want to scream or cry or both. "Your deed is solid, properly recorded with the Buncombe County Register. Your husband purchased this parcel through a private sale, cash, no liens, no encumbrances. The mineral rights convey, with the surface rights that's standard in North Carolina, unless explicitly severed. They weren't. This land and everything beneath it is legally yours." Then why is Boone breaking into my house? Because he wants it. And men like Boone Aldridge have spent their lives confusing what they want with what they're owed. Dale was right about what came next. The following week, a summons arrived at Ephraim's cabin. Nora had been collecting mail there for safety. Aldridge Mining, LLC, was suing for declaratory judgment, claiming the mineral rights beneath Nora's 12 acres had been previously severed and belonged to Aldridge through a chain of title dating back to the 1930s. The filing alleged that Rhodri Pemberton had obtained the property through fraudulent misrepresentation and that the deed should be voided. It was a lie built on paperwork. Boone had found or manufactured a document purporting to show a mineral rights severance from 1937. Dale obtained a copy and spent 3 days tracing the chain. The original deed from 1937 was genuine, but contained no severance clause. The document Boone submitted had been altered clumsily, if you knew where to look. "We can beat this in court," Dale told Nora, "but you should know Boone's firm has 3 attorneys and a war chest. We have me a paralegal named Donna, who works Tuesdays and Thursdays and whatever I can scrape from the non-profit's budget. It's not a fair fight. Nothing in my life has ever been a fair fight," Nora said. "Tell me what you need." What Dale needed turned out to be the USB drive. Nora had been carrying it in her jacket pocket for weeks, this tiny black rectangle, no bigger than her thumb, weightless and useless without a computer. Cora's nephew had a laptop. They plugged it in at the diner. After closing time, the 3 of them huddled around the screen while the coffee maker ticked and the neon sign buzzed in the window. The drive contained 2 folders. The first held scanned copies of every document related to Rhodri's land purchase, redundant backups, meticulous, exactly like him. The second folder was labeled Insurance. Inside were emails, dozens of them, a correspondence between Boone Aldridge and a geologist named Harmon Creech spanning 14 months. The emails discussed the sapphire deposit in specific technical detail: size, depth, estimated value, extraction, feasibility. They discussed Rhodri Pemberton by name. They discussed the need to acquire the property before Pemberton could develop the mineral claim. And in the final email dated 3 weeks before Rhodri's death, Boone had written a single line that Nora read 4 times before the words stopped rearranging themselves on the screen. Handle it. Whatever it costs, I want Pemberton out of the picture before spring. Dale sat back in his chair and took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt. He did this very slowly. This changes things, he said. This isn't just a property dispute anymore. This is evidence of conspiracy, maybe more. I need to send this to the U.S. Attorney's office in Asheville. Nora stared at the screen. Rhodri had known. He had gathered this evidence hidden. It prepared for the worst, and the worst had come anyway. He had spent his final months not just building a house and hiding money, but assembling a case against the man who would eventually, she was now certain, arrange his death. He had done all of this alone, in secret, to protect her and the children, and he had died before he could tell her any of it. The courtroom in Asheville smelled of old wood and floor polish. November light fell through tall windows in long pale rectangles across the gallery benches. Nora sat at the plaintiff's table in the only good dress she owned, navy blue, bought at the Goodwill in Weaverville, with her hands folded and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Boone Aldridge sat across the aisle with 2 attorneys in matching charcoal suits and a paralegal with a rolling case full of documents. He wore a bolo tie and a western-cut jacket, and the easy posture of a man who had never lost a fight in his home county. He didn't look at Nora. He didn't need to. His presence was its own kind of pressure. Dale presented the case with the quiet precision of a surgeon. The original deed unaltered. The county records showing no mineral rights severance. A handwriting expert who testified that the 1937 document Boone had submitted showed signs of digital manipulation. Ephraim, who testified about Rhodri's years of work on the property, his character, his intentions. Silas, who described the cave system, the sapphire deposit, and Boone's long-standing interest in the land. Boone's attorneys objected, redirected, challenged credentials. They were good. They made Silas look uncertain on cross-examination. They questioned Ephraim's memory. They painted Nora as an opportunist, a woman with no independent income who had conveniently discovered a fortune beneath land her husband had purchased in secret. Dale let them talk. Then he called his final witness, Nora Calloway, 8 years old. Nora had agonized over this for days. Dale had suggested it. Nora had refused, then reconsidered, then refused again. In the end, it was Wren who decided. She'd heard Nora and Dale talking on the porch, had understood more than either of them realized. "I want to, Mama. Daddy would want me to." Wren walked to the witness chair in her school clothes, a plaid skirt Cora had given her, a white blouse with a collar that wouldn't stay flat. Her auburn hair was braided. The rusty key hung around her neck on a piece of kitchen twine, dark against the white cotton of her shirt. The judge, a woman in her 60s, named Alvarez, with reading glasses and a reputation for impatience, looked at Wren with the careful attention she might give a piece of evidence she hadn't expected. Dale approached gently. "Wren, can you tell the court about your father?" Wren sat up straight. Her voice was small, but it didn't waver. "My daddy was an engineer. But what he really loved was building things with his hands. He built our house in the mountains. I didn't know about it until after he died. Nobody did. He kept it secret because he wanted us to have a place that was safe, a place nobody could take away. She paused. Her fingers found the key at her throat. He left a key for us. It was rusty and old, and my mama almost didn't find it. But she did, and it opened the door to the house he built. And inside there was a letter. He wrote that the house was built with bare hands and a full heart. The courtroom was silent. The court reporter's fingers had stopped. Wren looked directly at the judge. My daddy is dead, and some people tried to take our house, and some people tried to scare us. But my mama brought us to the mountains, and she kept us safe. She fixed the pipes, and she made the fire, and she carried my brother and my sister through a cave in the dark. And that house is ours. My daddy built it for us. Please don't let them take it. Judge Alvarez removed her glasses. She looked at Wren for a long moment, then at Boone Aldridge, then at the stack of documents on her bench. The ruling came 2 hours later. The court finds in favor of the defendant, Nora Calloway. The deed is valid. The mineral rights are intact and unsevered. The plaintiff's claim is denied with prejudice. Furthermore, the court is referring certain evidence submitted during these proceedings to the Office of the United States Attorney for the Western District of North Carolina for independent review. Boone Aldridge stood without expression, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the courtroom. He did not look at Nora. He did not look at anyone. His attorneys followed in silence. Nora sat at the table with her hands still folded, tears running down her face, unable to move. Dale put a hand on her shoulder. Wren climbed into her lap and pressed her forehead against her mother's neck. "We won, Mama. We won, sweetheart." They drove back to Weaverville in Ephraim's truck, all of them crowded into the cab. Nora, 3 children, Ephraim and Silas, riding in the bed with the cold wind in his face, smiling for the first time in years. The mountains rose around them, blue and ancient, holding their secrets the way they always had, patiently, without complaint. Boone Aldridge was indicted by a federal grand jury 4 months later on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. The investigation into Rhodri's death was reopened. Nora gave her testimony, and then she let it go. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but release. She had carried it long enough. The law could carry it now, 2 years later. October again. The maples along the ridge were burning gold and crimson, the same colors Nora remembered from a cemetery in Raleigh that felt like another lifetime. But here the colors were wilder, ungroomed, spilling across the mountainside in great ragged sweeps, and the air smelled of wood smoke and apples and the particular sweetness of leaves returning to the earth. The house had changed. Ephraim and Silas had added a second room for the children, framed in white oak with a window that faced east to catch the morning light. The garden had come back, not just herbs now, but beans, tomatoes, squash rows of lettuce, protected from deer by a fence Wren had helped build. The apple trees, pruned and cared for, hung heavy with fruit. Silas lived in a small cabin he'd built himself a 1/4 mile up the creek. He carved walking sticks and sold them at the farmer's market in Asheville, standing behind a folding table with a patience that seemed almost geological. He was brown from the sun now, thicker through the shoulders, a man returned to the world. He and Nora never spoke about the caves. There was nothing left to say about them. Ephraim came every Saturday. He was teaching Josiah, now 7, to use a hand plane. The boy stood at Rhodri's old workbench with his small hands wrapped around the handles, pushing the blade along a plank of cherry wood, watching the shavings curl up like ribbon. Ephraim stood behind him, correcting his grip, adjusting his angle, offering praise in small, careful doses. Wren, 10, now and tall for her age, had started a journal. She wrote in it every night, by the fire, filling pages with observations about the forest, which birds arrived first in spring, where the foxes denned, how the creek changed color after rain. She was becoming something Nora hadn't anticipated: a naturalist, a noticer, a girl who paid attention to the world with the same intensity her father had brought to a piece of wood. Laurel was 5 and ran barefoot from April to October. She talked to the chickens. Nora had built a coop the previous spring and insisted they had names and opinions and complicated social lives. She had no memory of Raleigh, no memory of the Pembertons or the funeral or the night in the caves. To her, this house in the hillside was the only world there was, and it was enough. On this particular October evening, Nora sat on the porch Rhodri had built in the rocking chair. Silas had finished the child-sized one from the workshop, had turned out to be for Laurel, who claimed it immediately and watched the light change on the mountains. The ridgeline went from green to gold to purple as the sun dropped. A woodpecker worked somewhere in the hemlocks. The creek played its one endless note. Wren came out and sat beside her, long legs folded under her, the journal in her lap. "Mama, do you think Daddy can see us?" Nora looked at her daughter, this serious, capable, beautiful girl who had climbed through a crack in a mountain in the dark without crying, who had stood in a courtroom and spoken truth to power at 8 years old, who wore a rusty key around her neck like other girls wore lockets. "I think he's in every board of this house, sweetheart. Every stone, every nail." Wren nodded slowly. She opened her journal and wrote something Nora couldn't see. Then she closed it and leaned against her mother's shoulder, and they watched the last light leave the mountains together. Later, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Nora stood at the front door. The round oak door Rhodri had shaped with his own hands, hung on iron hinges he'd forged at Ephraim's shop, fitted into a stone arch he'd laid one rock at a time. Over a summer, he'd told her, he spent at engineering conferences. She reached into her pocket and took out the rusty key. She hadn't carried it for months. Wren had claimed it, and Nora had let her. But today, Wren had given it back. "You should put it somewhere special, Mama. Somewhere we can all see it, so we remember." Nora hung the key on a small iron hook beside the door, next to a photograph of Rhodri. She'd framed, the one from the workshop, sawdust in his hair, laughing at nothing happier than she'd ever seen him in Raleigh. The key and the photograph hung side by side, rust and light, the thing that opened the door and the man who'd built it. Nora touched the photograph once lightly, the way you touch something precious that you're no longer afraid of breaking. Then she stepped outside into the cold October night. The stars were out. All of them, it seemed, more stars than any city dweller could imagine. The Milky Way spilled across the sky like a river of light, flowing toward some destination she couldn't see but trusted was there. The mountains stood dark against the sky, patient and immense and older than memory. The creek sang. An owl called from the ridge. The wind moved through the hemlocks with a sound like breathing, like the whole forest was asleep and dreaming. Nora stood barefoot on the cold ground, the ground her husband had bought and built upon and died protecting. The ground her children played on, grew on, would someday bring their own children to. The ground that held sapphires in its depths and secrets in its stone, and the memory of a man who had loved his family enough to plan for a future he wouldn't live to see. She looked up at the sky and smiled. Not because the pain was gone, it would never be entirely gone, but because the pain had become something else, a root system deep and tangled, anchoring her to this place, to this life, to the woman she had become in the year since a rusty key fell out of a shoebox and changed everything. Some keys don't just open doors, they open the life you were always meant to live. Nora went back inside. She closed the round door behind her. The latch clicked a small, definite sound, like a heartbeat, like a promise, and the house held her family through another mountain night, solid and warm, built with bare hands and a full heart, standing exactly where it was always meant to stand. And that's where we'll leave Nora Calloway, tonight safe in the house her husband built, surrounded by children who carry his laughter in their bones on a mountain that keeps its promises even when the world does not. Her story reminds us that the people we lose don't disappear entirely. They live on in the doors they opened for us, in the shelters they built when we didn't even know we'd need them, in the quiet acts of love we only discover after they're gone. If someone in your life ever built something just so you'd be safe, a home, a savings account, a letter you haven't found yet, take a moment tonight to remember them. And if you're the one doing the building, know this, it matters. Even if they never see you holding the hammer, especially then, tell us in the comments what's the one thing someone left behind that changed your life. Subscribe. If this story stayed with you, and we'll see you in the next one, sleep well tonight. You're safe here.